There is a place in the Pacific where the waves do not just crash against the rocks, they scream. If you stand at the edge of the northern cliffs of Saipan, you can almost feel it. The weight of a tragedy so profound, it broke the soul of a nation. In the summer of 1944, this small patch of emerald land became the stage for a nightmare that defies human comprehension. It was a place where mothers became executioners, where soldiers became shadows, and where the sun of Imperial Japan began its final bloody descent into the sea. This is not just a story of a battle. This is the story of the day the world watched an entire civilization choose death over defeat. In June 1944, Saipan was the most important piece of dirt on Earth. For the Americans, it was the key. For the Japanese, it was the wall. Saipan sat in the Marianas, exactly 1,100 miles from Tokyo. That distance changed everything. From the airfields of Saipan, the new American B-29 Superfortress bombers could reach the Japanese home islands and return. Tokyo was finally in range. The firestorms were coming. The defense of this vital gateway fell to two men trapped by fate. Lieutenant General Saito, a man of iron discipline, and Vice Admiral Nagumo. Nagumo was once the Titan of the Pacific, the man who led the carriers at Pearl Harbor. But since his humiliating defeat at Midway, he had lost his face, his pride, and his purpose. He was a ghost in a naval uniform, wallowing in shame. They led a garrison of over 30,000 men, twice what American intelligence expected. But they were a garrison of doomed men. American submarines had strangled their supply lines. The food was gone. The ammunition was low. They knew the Americans were coming, and they knew they were not going home. The end began on June 13th. The sky over Saipan vanished behind a curtain of smoke. 7 American battleships unleashed a thunderclap that could be felt in the marrow of the bone. 15,000 shells tore into the island's defenses. It was a storm of steel designed to erase the Japanese from the map. But the defenders were dug in deep. They were in the caves. They were in the earth. They waited in the dark, listening to the world above being shredded. Then came D-Day, June 15th. 8,000 U.S. Marines hit the beaches in just 20 minutes. The water turned red instantly. Despite the massive bombardment, the Japanese resistance was ferocious. Hidden artillery zeroed in on the landing craft. The sand became a graveyard. The Marines bled for every inch, losing 10% of their force before the first day was over. But they did not stop. They kept coming. Behind them, the Army's 27th Division landed, funneling more and more steel into the meat grinder. The beachhead was a chaotic mess of fire and screams, but it held. The invasion of Saipan had begun, and there was no turning back. General Saito realized he could not win on the beaches. He ordered his men into the treacherous spine of the island, Mount Tapochau. These were not just mountains. They were fortresses of jagged limestone and dense, suffocating jungle. The Japanese transformed the terrain into a nightmare of hidden bunkers and sniper nests. As the Americans pushed north, the stress fractured their own command. A bitter political war erupted between Marine General Holland Smith and Army General Ralph Smith. The Marines moved with aggressive, suicidal speed. The Army moved with careful, methodical caution. This difference in philosophy left the American lines bent and vulnerable. In an unprecedented move, Holland Smith fired the Army general, sparking a row that reached all the way to Washington. But while the generals fought in their tents, the soldiers fought in the mud. The caves became scenes of primal horror. Flamethrowers licked into the dark, turning defensive positions into crematoriums. The smell of scorched earth and decomposing bodies hung heavy in the humid air. The Japanese were retreating, but they were selling their lives at a price the Americans would never forget. By July 5th, the Japanese were cornered. They had been driven to the northern tip of the island. Their backs were against the cliffs. There was nowhere left to run. No reinforcements were coming. No miracle would save them. General Saito and Admiral Nagumo sat in their final command bunker, surrounded by the stench of failure. They had one final order to give. "I will advance to seek out the enemy," Saito wrote. "Whether I die or whether I survive, I will not be ashamed." But the Admiral and the General would not join the final charge. They could not live with the reality of what was coming. On the morning of July 6th, in the quiet of their bunkers, they committed ritual suicide. Nagumo, the man who had once commanded the world's most powerful fleet, ended his life in a hole in the ground. Saito followed. Their deaths were a signal. The end of the organized defense was over. Now, there was only the madness. The morning of July 7th saw the largest suicide charge of the war. 3,000 Japanese troops, many wounded, some armed only with bayonets lashed to bamboo poles, emerged from the smoke. It was a wave of human desperation. They did not charge to win. They charged to die. They broke through the American western flank, screaming Banzai until their lungs gave out. It was a scene of absolute carnage. American Marines and Army regulars were forced into hand-to-hand combat, swinging rifle butts and knives in the gray light of dawn. The Japanese came on in a sea of blood, trampling their own dead to reach the American lines. When the sun finally rose, the madness stopped. Over 4,000 Japanese bodies lay in piles across the landscape. The American lines held, but the cost was staggering. The organized resistance on Saipan was dead, but the true horror was only just beginning. What happened next is a stain on human history. Throughout the battle, Tokyo had broadcast a terrifying message to the thousands of Japanese civilians on the island. They told them, the Americans are monsters. They will torture you. They will kill your children. It is better to die with honor. Thousands of terrified civilians fled to the northernmost points of the island, places now known as Banzai Cliff and Suicide Cliff. The Americans watched through binoculars in absolute helpless horror. They used loudspeakers, pleading with the civilians to come in. They promised food, water, and safety. But the propaganda had taken hold. Mothers stood at the edge of the jagged cliffs, clutching their infants. They did not cry. They did not hesitate. They threw their babies against the rocks below before jumping into the churning, shark-ridden waters themselves. Children held onto grenades, pulling the pins and holding them to their chests, before leaping into the abyss. Fathers led their families into the sea with weights tied to their waists. Some civilians were shot by their own soldiers to prevent surrender. Nearly 8,000 civilians perished in a mass suicide that turned the blue Pacific into a graveyard. The sound of bodies hitting the rocks was a drumbeat of despair that would haunt the American witnesses for the rest of their lives. On July 9th, Saipan was declared secure, but there was no celebration. Holland Smith's men had counted 23,000 Japanese soldiers dead. The Americans had lost nearly 3,500. But the numbers could not capture the psychological devastation. When the news of the civilian mass suicides reached Tokyo, the government collapsed. Prime Minister Tojo resigned. The people of Japan finally understood the truth. The Americans were at the door, and they were not going away. The capture of Saipan was the beginning of the end. Within months, the airfields were buzzing with B-29s. The firebombing of Tokyo, the destruction of Japan's cities, and eventually the atomic clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki all trace their roots back to this bloody island. Today, Banzai Cliff and Suicide Cliff are quiet. Peace has returned to the Marianas. But if you listen closely to the wind as it whips across the limestone, you can still hear the echo of that terrible summer. Saipan was not just a battle of territory. It was the moment Imperial Japan realized that the path they had chosen led only to the grave. It was the battle that broke the heart of an empire, and the scars it left on the world have never truly healed.